Welcome to today's Explainer. Think of this as a lecture where we're going to literally walk the cobblestones of Nuremberg. We're looking at how this proud, deeply German city became the ultimate stage for both the Third Reich's greatest glories and, ultimately, its international judgment. I mean, just close your eyes for a second and picture a medieval city square. The exact same market squares where Renaissance masters used to walk and sketch. Well, centuries later, those would echo with the boots of totalitarian crowds. It's a massive historical whiplash, and that tension is exactly what we're unpacking today.
So here is our syllabus for today. We'll start with the heart of the empire, move on to Durer and the Renaissance, look at exactly why the Nazis chose Nuremberg, examine the architecture of their propaganda, and finally end with judgment in the ruins.
All right, part one, the heart of the empire.
Let's travel way back to the Middle Ages. To really understand Nuremberg, we have to map out its rise as this incredible fortress of imperial power. It all kicks off around 1050 with the Signa Charter, centered right around a massive imperial castle built on a sandstone rock. Then, jump to 1219, and the emperor grants the city the Great Letter of Freedom. Basically, this removed Nuremberg from local control entirely. And as a quick, super interesting side note, Nuremberg got so incredibly wealthy from international trade during this time that it was kind of like the medieval Manhattan. It was famous all over Europe for producing these exquisite children's toys and really advanced precision instruments. But the huge political turning point, that's 1356 with the Golden Bull. This was a foundational constitutional law that said every newly elected king of the Holy Roman Empire literally had to hold their very first imperial diet, their first governing assembly, right here in Nuremberg. And to top it off, by 1423, the city was trusted with the Imperial Regalia, literally the crown jewels of the empire.
And this historical quote really just nails it: the most distinguished, best located city of the realm. This title gave Nuremberg immense symbolic weight because it was sitting right at the crossroads of major European trade routes and answered only to the emperor himself. It essentially became the unofficial capital of the Holy Roman Empire.
Which brings us to Section 2. Durer and the Renaissance.
Moving into our second act, we see all that vast wealth mixed with this really unique lack of traditional guild restrictions, just completely sparking a golden age of humanism and scientific innovation. And we absolutely have to talk about Nuremberg's most famous son, Albrecht Durer. Imagine Durer born right here in 1471 to a goldsmith, walking around those busy medieval market squares. He travels down to Italy, absorbs all these classical ideals of geometry and anatomy, and brings them right back to Germany. He completely elevated the individual human form. But even more than that, he redefined what an artist actually was. Before Durer, artists up north were mostly just seen as, craftsmen or laborers. Durer turned the artist into a respected, educated, intellectual creator.
But what's truly revolutionary is how Durer used the absolute game-changing technology of his time, the printing press. See, Durer didn't just paint for wealthy patrons. He used the press to mass-produce these masterful woodcuts and engravings, like his incredibly famous Apocalypse series. He basically invented the mass communication of fine art. Suddenly, his celebration of scientific truth, individual dignity, and humanism could just spread like wildfire all over Europe. He was arguably the very first truly international artist.
But here, we really have to pause. We need to confront a bitter, bitter irony. We have to ask ourselves, how on earth did this cradle of the Northern Renaissance, this absolute hub of humanist thought and artistic liberation, become systematically co-opted for the darkest chapter in human history?
Let's dig into that in Section 3, why the Nazis chose Nuremberg.
There is a really stark architectural contrast to consider. Hitler didn't just pick Nuremberg out of a hat. He specifically staged his massive party rallies against the backdrop of Nuremberg's medieval castle and its Gothic churches. He was trying to forge a false, direct visual continuity between his regime, the so-called Third Reich, and the ancient, legitimate glory of the First Reich, the Holy Roman Empire. He was literally stealing Nuremberg's imperial majesty to validate his brand-new totalitarian state.
Beyond the historical symbolism, though, the city offered some chillingly practical advantages. Nuremberg was an early hotbed for Nazi support way back in the 1920s. It had a highly sympathetic police chief, and the city was under the control of the militant Gauleiter Julius Streicher. Plus, the city just had vast open spaces, like the loopholed Hind Park, which provided the massive acreage they needed for the theatrical displays of power the regime was planning.
Which leads us to Section 4, the architecture of propaganda.
Now walk with me into the massive party rallies of the 1920s and 30s. This wasn't just a gathering, right?
The very architecture of the city was being redesigned to overwhelm the human spirit. Let's look at how this builds. Starting from smaller gatherings in 1923, the rallies evolved into these annual, monumental spectacles involving hundreds of thousands of people. You had Albrecht Speer designing the Cathedral of Light, literally 152 anti-aircraft searchlights pointing straight up into the night sky, creating this illusory, terrifyingly grand architecture. And filmmakers like Leni Riefenstahl were capturing these carefully staged rituals to project an image of an invincible, united Germany. It was an absolute masterclass in psychological manipulation.
And this brilliantly illustrates that tragic whiplash I mentioned at the start of our lecture. Think about Durer's Nuremberg, a lifelong dedication to the beauty of the individual, the pursuit of scientific truth, elevating the human mind. Now look at Hitler's Nuremberg, a regime completely intent on crushing individuality into a synchronized, unthinking mass, driven by racial propaganda and totalitarian conformity. The contrast is just devastating.
Consider this chilling reality for a second. Remember how Durer pioneered the printing press to elevate mankind? Well, now that exact same technology in that exact same city was polluted by Julius Streicher's anti-Semitic newspaper, Der Stürmer. At the time, citizens would gather around publicly displayed pages in the streets, just reading state-sponsored hate. The tools of mass communication were being fully weaponized to spread racial hatred and groom the populace for atrocities.
So the absolutely crucial point here is that these rallies were not just pageantry or empty showmanship. At the 1935 rally, Hitler specifically convened the Reichstag in Nuremberg to pass the Nuremberg Laws. This legislation systematically stripped German Jews of their citizenship. It legally erased the very humanity that Renaissance thinkers had fought so hard to define and celebrate. These rallies were, quite literally, the legal birthplace of the Holocaust.
Finally, we reach our last section, Judgment in the Ruins. For our final act, we arrive in the ashes of 1945. Germany is defeated, Nuremberg is practically 90% destroyed by Allied bombing, and the Allied powers have to make a highly calculated decision about the fate of the defeated regime's leadership. So why did they choose to hold the military tribunals in Nuremberg? First off, the symbolic value was unmatched. The Allies purposefully brought the architects of the regime back to the very cobblestones where their propaganda was born, effectively extinguishing the Nazi myth right at its source. On a practical level, the Palace of Justice had miraculously survived the bombings largely intact, and its massive adjoining prison complex was capable of safely housing the detainees. The ultimate stage of their glory was transformed into the site of their reckoning.
The International Military Tribunal indicted 24 major war criminals. But what's truly revolutionary is what they were actually charged with: crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. Up until this point, you see, international law was largely about states. Nuremberg fundamentally created modern international criminal law by establishing that individuals, not just abstract nations or systems, can and will be held personally accountable for atrocities. Sovereignty was no longer a shield.
And the justice didn't stop with just the major political leaders. Subsequent proceedings, like the doctor's trial, addressed the horrific medical experiments of the regime. Out of this trial came the Nuremberg Code of 1947. This was a 10-point ethical framework that established, once and for all, the absolute necessity of voluntary informed consent in medical research. It firmly, finally, re-established the sanctity of human rights in science.
This presents the ultimate historical dialectic of our lecture today. The very same city that authored the legal destruction of a people through the Nuremberg Laws later birthed the foundational principles of modern human rights. The precedents set right in this city led directly to the Genocide Convention, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and the International Criminal Court we have today. As a United Nations memorandum really eloquently put it, from now on, the instigators of new wars must know that there exist both law and punishment for their crimes. These trials prove that civilization could respond to unimaginable barbarism, not with blind vengeance, but with the measured, undeniable weight of the law. As we wrap up today's explainer, I want to leave you with a final, really provocative thought. Think back to those cobblestones we mentally walked at the beginning of this lecture. How do we, as students of history, even begin to reconcile a single city that managed to host the absolute pinnacle of human artistry, the deepest abyss of totalitarian hatred, and the birth of global justice? It's a stark reminder that the spaces we build are only as noble or as terrible as the ideals we choose to enact within them. Thank you so much for joining me today.